Welcome to tonight's shiur, Motzei Shabbos, Parshas Toldos. And so we'll go straight into something very interesting shiur, not a question of halacha, which I came across this week. We have on Shmini Atzeres and on Shmini Atzeres at Musaf, when we switch over to start saying Masha Baruch Merida Geshem, we have a poem in Musaf, in the repetition of Musaf, and it's attributed to Rebbe Haliri, and there's six stanzas here, and they correspond to, the first one is referring to Avram Avinu, Ovnim Shacharis Chakamayim. The second one is Yitzchok, who was born by the Besoyer of Yukach Nomat Mayim. The third one is Yaakov, who crosses the water, the Yarden, with his staff. This fourth one is Moshe Rabbeinu, drawn from in a basket from the water. And we have the fifth one is Aaron, who tovels in the as a Kohen Gadol, tovels 7 times on 5 times on Yom Kippur. And then we've got the 12 Shvatim, who were they were delivered across the Yam Suf in tunnels of water. The question which is asked is, we see that there's the chorus. It looks like the original idea was that the Chazan would say the main stanza, and the congregation would respond with call it a chorus if you want, and they would say, here they would say Bavure Altim Namoyim, here they would say Batzidkei Chon Chashras Moyim. So we have, it alternates. One time the response is Altim Namoyim, and the other one is Chon Chashras Moyim. So what's the logic there? What's going on there? So there's this sefer which written about 170 years ago, or this sefer was printed Tovkuf Ayin Dalet, so it's printed more than 200 years ago, and he has the following fascinating explanation. He says, when we talk about a concern about the provision of water, there could be 2 types of concern. There could be that we are pleading in case Hashem had originally allocated that there would be a bracha of water, abundance of water, and there may be some reason that we have merited, if that's the right word, that it should be discontinued, that there shouldn't be a provision of water. So we're asking that Hashem should not withhold the provision of water which had been allocated already. It could be the other way around. There could be that there had been a decree that there shouldn't be a provision of water, and then the plea is that if there had been such a decree, that the decree should be overturned, and there should be, nevertheless, there should be a provision of water. So again, there could be a plea that if there had been a bracha for water, that bracha should not be withdrawn. There could be the other way around. There's a bracha that there had not been allocated, and we're asking to overturn that there should be a bracha nevertheless. And so now let's look at these 6 stages, characters, etc., tzaddikim. So we have those who had an experience with challenges with water, and they prevailed in tefillah, and they were and the challenge was overcome, and water was provided. And then we have those who had no challenge with water, and whether were tzaddikim. So Avram Avinu, we don't see any experience in his life that there was a shortage of water. I know there was a famine, he went down, but we don't see that he had a shortage of water per se. And therefore, we say, okay, in the Schus of Avram, Bavuroi Altim Namoyim, there's been allocated water in the Schus of Avram, that allocation should not be withdrawn. Yitzchok, by contrast, had a parsha with the wells, which we talk about this week in the Sedra, and so there was a business that he was seeking water, and he succeeded in getting water. So therefore, betzidkoi choin chashras moim, in the merit of Yitzchok, so therefore there should be a provision of water even if there are challenges. We go to Yaakov. Yaakov does not have a problem with a shortage of water. And so in his chus we say, that the water should be, the bracha should remain, that it shouldn't be withheld. Then we have Moshe Rabbeinu. So he does have a challenge with water. There's a time when the people, the Idnas, are short of water, and they are thirsty. And then there's a whole story with the rock. And so, but in his merit, you should give us water nevertheless, even though there was a challenge. Later we go to Aaron HaKohen again. We don't see him having to deal with a shortage of water, and therefore And then we have the Shvotim, when they come to a place where there was the water was bitter, and then so that they were challenged water-wise. Therefore, we ask them that we ask in their merit that if there is a challenge and there's been decreed there shouldn't be water, but Hashem should provide water in abundance. I mentioned that before that Avram, there was a famine in his time, but we don't see that he had a particular dealing with overcoming. He doesn't solve the water problem, whereas Yitzchak does, Moshe deRabonon does, and so do the Shvotim. Well, with Moshe, with the story with the bitter water. Okay, let's move on. And in the Sefer there also discusses the difference why you say sometimes bavuroi, sometimes a betzidko, but I don't want to go into that. This is Pashuda Geshmaka explanation. Okay, now I often daven at the Omid, not only because I love davening at the Omid, but I like that things should be on time, and so I go to the Omid. And then it's a weekday Shacharis, and I, looking around, we start saying Kaddish deRabonon. There's a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe printed in Sefer Mamorim Topshin Tes, later in the Igris, about the importance of saying the Kaddish deRabonon before davening. Okay, so I start saying Kaddish, and then, as I've just said the first sentence, then someone in the back starts saying Kaddish. So he's a chiyuv, but I didn't know that he's a chiyuv, whatever, he starts saying Kaddish. So now, do I have to finish the Kaddish which I've started, or can I just stop short, let him continue? This is my dilemma. So I just came across a Gemara, B'Hashgacha Protis, in Gemara, the Brochas Daf Yudal Amud Beis. And, well, but let's start a similar Gemara, similar Loshen, is in Gemara in Tainas Daf Chof Ches. So in Tainas Daf Chof Ches, it talks about Halal on Rosh Chodesh. So it tells us the story. Rav comes to Bovel. He lived first in Eretz Yisrael. He comes to Bovel, and he sees that they're saying Halal on Rosh Chodesh. Never heard of such a thing. So he had considered to stop them, but then he saw that they are skipping parts. So he said, I see that there's some, the minhag is saying b'idei, and evidently there's been someone who had considered how to introduce it, and Dafkan not saying the full halal to differentiate between that and the days when we say halal as a duty, as a chiyuv, and so all right. So he sees that it's a responsible decision here, not just out of ignorance. And then it finishes off. Tono, we learned in the Braise, yochid lo yaschil. So although there is a custom of saying halal and Rosh Chodesh, but a yochid should not. V'im hischil goimer. If he did start, then he should finish off. So I'm not going to go into the whole halacha of halal and Rosh Chodesh, and that whole thing with the Alter Rebbe about being yotze from the Chazan, etc. Written in the Sedra. There's a lot of discussion about that. But I'm just picking up on this thing, this idea. You shouldn't begin, but if you began, you finish the unit which you've started. So that's the Gemara in Tainas Daf Chof Ches. Now we have here in Brochas Daf Yudaled, so we have the following story. Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda says that in Marovo, that in Eretz Yisrael, at Ma'ariv, now there's a whole question, do you have to say the third parsha of Shema in the evening? Because after all, the third parsha has got to do with tzitzis, and by night there's no chiyuv to wear tzitzis, because it says Oreisem Oishoy. So there was a discussion, an idea whether one needs to say the third parsha. So he says, in Eretz Yisrael, in the evening, they would say the following: Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem, ani Hashem Elokeichem emes. They just said the first part and the last three words, with the word emes afterwards. Says Abaye, what's so wonderful about this? But Rav Kahana had said in the name of Rav, in the evening, lo yaschil, you don't need to start the third parsha. But if you started the third parsha, you have to say the whole parsha. You can say that the Omarta Alehem is only a preamble. It's not a beginning of the actual content. So, but Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchok says Daber Bnei Yisrael is not a haschala, but Omarta Alehem is a haschala. It's considered that you started. So the Papa says, all right, so in this point, whether Omarta Alehem is a preamble or is a haschala, there's a machala that they don't agree. Unless you say, but also lehem tzitzis. Then you started saying the content of the parsha. So Abai concludes, Anan we start saying Vayomer, because even in Marova, they also would start. But then, once we start, then Rabbit said, if you start, then you have to finish. So Kirin Aschilino Mikmernami Gamrino. As we have the idea, as Rav Kahana in the name of Rav had said, as we said before, Lo Yaschil, Im Hischil Goimer. So we're seeing an identical lotion, that whether it's here, it's about the Shema, and here it's about Hallel, but Lo Yaschil, you don't need to start, but if you start, you finish. So I'm seeing a similar svara here, that although I didn't have to say Kaddish, but possibly I might be totally wrong, and I looked around and couldn't find anyone who comments on this. But in Hischil Goimer, we had a similar thing just this past week, that it was on Rosh Chodesh, and there's a fellow who's a chiyuv, and he on Rosh Chodesh is not davening at the Yomit. At the end of a Hallel, so he started saying Kaddish, and then says, no, it's a Kaddish for the Chazan, it's not your Kaddish. So these are not the same. One was starting Kaddish legitimately, but then someone else comes in. There, perhaps you could say it wasn't his business to say Kaddish at all, so he stopped. Lapoli stopped, but I just find it interesting to see the svaras here. Right, let's move on. So now I was at the Kinus HaShluchim in New York, and a couple of people, Bashgacha protests, I don't know whether they had any connection with one another, asking about Keil Erech HaPayim, which we say on Mondays and Thursdays. Has that got to do with Kriyas HaTorah? So this is, you can see a picture from the Tilas Hashem Sedra, I think, or Torah Sedra. Then on Sheni V'Chamishi, on Mondays and Thursdays, after Tachnun, after Kaddish, before opening the Aron Kodesh, or even Soya, we have this passage of Keil Erech HaPayim. Now, has that got to do with Kriyas HaTorah? In other words, if you, for whatever reason, are not davening with a minyan, do you still say that passage because it is Monday and Thursday? Or has it got to do with, it's a preamble to Kriyas HaTorah, like by Hivin Seyarim? Another variation of the same question, if, let's say, you're one of the slower daveners in the minyan, and so you're middle of saying Tachnun, and they've opened the Aron Kodesh, and now, so do you interrupt in the middle of your sequence of Tachnun? Of course, Vayibin Soya and Vayberich Shmei is time sensitive, so you're going to say it then. What about Keil Erech HaPayim? Is it also time sensitive to be said then, or can you just leave it when you get there, when you're finished? Eventually, you'll say it where it belongs in the Siddur. So this is the question: is this a prayer to be said on Mondays and Thursdays, or is it a preamble to Kriyas HaTorah? I told them off the cuff that it's a preamble to Kriyas HaTorah. In the Siddur, the notes which I'd written in the Siddur, I'd discussed this, and you can see on the left that this is written in the Sefer Isha Yisrael, quotes from Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that it's a mispal b'yochid, does not say Keil Erech HaPayim, and that it is a preamble to Kriyas HaTorah. Just to support that, on the right side of the screen, you have a quote from the Matei Moshe. To fill you in, the Matei Moshe is a Talmud of the Maharshal. He and his sefer is all reasons for explanations, backgrounds for in Yonim of davening, etc. So he writes on Mondays and Thursdays, what's the significance of saying this plea at this point? So he says, because we're going to now read in the Torah, and we are aware that we have violated the Torah in some occasion, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is marich apoi, he's patient with us, with his great mercy and kindness. Therefore, as we're about to read the Torah, we say Keler Chapayim before we start saying Kriyas Torah, reading the Torah. Fascinating. So it's a kind of, because we're going to read the Torah, and it might be a reflection of guilt upon us. Therefore, we ask for a special tefillah that we shouldn't be punished, so to speak, for those violations. But it's clearly his saying it's got to do with Kriyas Torah. What I remember also, and the Siddur referred to this, is that the Abu Darham says that this also applies on a fast day. If you have a Sorry, Batavis, let's say, if that would be on a Tuesday. So it'd say Keler Chapayim, because it's an introduction to Kriyas Torah. It's not limited to Mondays and Thursdays. It's got to do with it. It's a preamble to Kriyas Torah. Now, Naftali is writing here, there was once in this upstairs Zal, someone began saying Kaddish at the wrong time. People tried to shush him, and the Rebbe says, Lozim Endik, and let him finish off the Kaddish. Yes, thank you for reminding me about that. That, I believe, was on Rosh Chodesh. Now, what we do normally on Rosh Chodesh, we don't finish off Ovolet Sion aloud, so that, otherwise you'd have to say Kaddish, and instead we bring back the Sefer Torah without a Kaddish, switch off, take off Rashi's and put a Rebbeinu Tams, and then we say Kaddish and start off Musaf. Now this fellow had said the Kaddish earlier than necessary, than appropriate, and yes, thank you. So that's supporting this idea that even though he shouldn't have been saying Kaddish then, and it was a whole confusion, but the Rebbe said to finish off. Although I don't know how far he had gone, but okay, we have certainly a shtickle meiser Rav to support this, that once you've started, you finish the Kaddish. Thank you. Let's move on to the next point. Fascinating. As I'm in the United States, it's about 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, whatever, in New York, and I get a phone call from someone he says, I'm traveling, this is on Monday, is Erev Rosh Chodesh. I'm traveling to Hong Kong via Japan, and so he's traveling across the Pacific. And he says about to get onto the plane. Let's say his departure is 2 o'clock. Now, since he's traveling along with the sun, he's going to have a very long afternoon. And it's going to remain light for most of the journey. And by the time he lands in Japan, it's going to be nightfall. Now, because it's crossing the date line, he will be going it will be, instead of Monday afternoon, by the time he lands in Japan, it will be Tuesday afternoon, actually Tuesday evening. So he will have missed out on Rosh Chodesh. He says, what do I do about Hallel, about Musaf, etc.? So as I say, it was very much on the spur of the moment. And I told him, I think that since you're going to a new day, you should daven again, Shacharis, etc., and Musaf. But I said to him that the mumche on this is actually Rabbi Leshes in Melbourne, who's done a lot of research. It's the Rov of the Yeshiva, whatever, the young Yeshiva, Armenian. And right afterwards, I sent an email to Rabbi Leshes and asked him, how do they paskin? Now, I hadn't considered, when I told him to daven Shacharis again, you know what? It's not going to get earlier. He's traveling at 2 o'clock. Let's say he's not going to get earlier in time. It'll be 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, etc. It's not going to go back to Shacharis time. So there was no reason for him to have to go back to Shacharis. But he would, once he crosses the date line, he would be able to daven musaf, etc. So that's the all right. So now this is what happened on Monday, and then I'm going to share with you Rabbi Lesh's answer. Yeah. So here you go. He writes the consensus in Australia, and that's of deRabonon, I guess, that there's the day, there's the time of the day, and there is the date. So when you cross the date line, it's still the same day, and therefore you don't have to do Shacharis again or Mincha again. It's still the same day, but it's a different date. So it will change from Monday to Tuesday. It will change from Erev Rosh Chodesh to Rosh Chodesh, etc. Therefore, in our instance, he writes that he's traveled on Erev Rosh Chodesh, and Erev Rosh Chodesh. So now he would once he crosses the date line, it would become Rosh Chodesh for him, and on that basis he would daven Mincha. He'd say Yalav Yova at Mincha. He'd say Hallel. He could daven Musaf once it's crossed the date line. He says that's the majority of the Rabbanim in Melbourne who would say that you go by your current location. So once you've passed the date line, there's a whole discussion where is the date line, but once you are satisfied that you've crossed the Halocha date line, so at that point it becomes from Monday to Tuesday, and it becomes Rosh Chodesh becomes Rosh Chodesh, and you'll daven a Musaf and a Hallel, etc. However, Reb Chaim Tzvi Grona, son of the late Levi Yitzchok Grona, says no, and he says you're bound by your original location, regardless of the fact that you've traveled across the date line. And so, actually, Rabbi Chaim Tzvi was in New York, and he posted this guidance on the, I guess, from the Australian Shluchim chat line, whatever it's called, and he says that those who are leaving on Monday night, which is Rosh Chodesh, and they will arrive on Wednesday. So he says that they will keep American time. They'll still say Shacharis and the Yalav Yova, even if they cross the date line in flight. This is based upon the Rebbe's psak, that your day follows your point of origin until you arrive at your destination and disembark. Now, as the Rabbi Lesha says, the Rebbe's answer in relation to his mother's travels. Now, the background to this, actually, I heard this years ago, and subsequently, I wrote it up, and then subsequently, after Rabbi Leibel Grona passed away, they found in his archives his version of how he was there at the time. So the story is the following: that Rabbi Yitzchok David Grona went to Australia to live there as a shliach around 1963. His wife had just given birth, and as a result, she wasn't ready to travel, long journey, and several months later, she gets on a train from New York to Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, she gets onto a boat with her 6 kinderlach, and at some stage, she looks at the schedule of the boat arrival in Sydney, and it's going to be arriving on Sunday, which in American days would be still Shabbos. So she had this dilemma. What's she going to do? If according to what her counting, she'll be arriving on Shabbos, she'll have a problem of getting off the boat. So she sent a telegram to her husband, who contacted his brother. Her husband was in Melbourne, and he contacted his brother Reb Leibel, who was in New York. I asked the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told him to ask this Rov for his take on it, another one, and the Rebbe wasn't satisfied. And the third one, I believe, was Rabbi Menachem Kasher, who had written extensively about the Halacha dateline, and he gave the following advice, which the Rebbe was happy with. And what this was relayed to Mrs. Grona on the boat, the following guidance: that once the captain announces they've crossed the date line, they should try to get off the boat at a port, obviously, and disembark if possible, to spend a night in that location. If not, at least to have a meal, to sit down and to be kavua. Once they've settled, so to speak, on the other side of the date line, then they can align themselves with the timing as in Australia rather than the timing of America, and they would be able to therefore be landing on Sunday rather than Shabbos. So what's being understood from this is that if you haven't disembarked, you're still bound by your point of departure time, even though you've crossed the date line. That's where he's coming from. Now, then I'm going to share with you this. I also heard from Rabbi Grona Olav Shalom, and eventually Chaim Tzvi found this in his files, in father's files, and he shared this with me. Again, this is printed up in the Siva Mistei Shlichus, volume Gimel. So this is a Isarusa de Le'ela. Rabbi Yitzchok Grona was in New York, and the Rebbe gives him a job. Yevareb Sak Din Rav. Rabbi Yitzchok Grona himself was an eminent Talmud Chacham, but I believe the Rebbe was referring to him to get a more solid psak, verify and get a decision of a Rav. Hanichnas ba'aviron b'yom vov. One who enters a plane on a Friday, va'aviron mamshich b'li hefsek yirida hanaya ba'aretz, and the plane continues without a stop landing on ground. It's just continues to fly. Gam le'achrei shkias hachama b'mokim sheyotze misham, and you're still on the plane. It's still flying, and it's already now past sunset where you've left. Ma'adina, what's the halacha? So let's say if we would take a plane in winter, or let's say a 10 o'clock flight, so this would arrive in New York time, let's say 1 o'clock, but in English time it would be 6 o'clock. So in the winter that would be well into Shabbos. And so everybody's asking, what's the halacha? Are you allowed to travel in a way that before you land, it's already Shabbos in the place where you departed from? So this seems to be a similar approach, that although in real time where you are now, it's not Shabbos yet, but you are still possibly bound by the Shabbos of where you left. At the time, Rabbi Grona did discuss this. This is Tofshin Mem approximately. He discusses this with Reb Zalman Shimon Dvorkin, who said that Lachatchila you shouldn't travel in such a way. If you did, when you arrive at your destination, you're going to have to be Makabel Shabbos immediately, even though it's well before Plag HaMincha. That was Reb Zalman Shimon's psak. But meanwhile, what we're seeing here is an idea that you still maintain the status of your point of departure until you land. What I would just suggest, though, is that you have the idea in Gemara Psochim, in Mokim Shenagu, Noisnin Olav Chumre HaMokim Sheyotze Misham, etc. There is such a concept that the stringencies of your point of departure will apply until you become a local in a different location. I'm not sure whether that is a chumrah or it is a hard and fast halacha. Would that be also used lekula? And therefore, I'm asking here. Seems to be where Chaim Tzvi's svara, that you're bound by. You're still an American time, and therefore it's Rosh Chodesh, in his case, until you land in Australia, because you're going for. I'm wondering whether that is just a l'chumra, or also, and therefore, but if it's just l'chumra, then perhaps you should say halal and you should say musaf, because the ikar is you should go according to where you are. But as far as Shabbos is concerned, you should be machmir not to take such a trip because of the chumrah of perhaps you should be bound by the mokim yitzios. I'm not sure, but I haven't seen anything in writing about this from Rabbi Grona, but I'm just wondering. And so you see that you got this, what Rabbi Halocho is saying, the majority of the Rabbanim there take the view You go according to the current location once you've crossed the date line. So you'd look at the real time, whereas we have that other opinion. Okay, so if you are taking trips to Australia, crossing the date line, ask a shaila before you do, more than half an hour before takeoff. Okay, let's move on. Now, here's someone. Now, we've discussed this not long ago, and I went at the Kinos on a Friday night. So, a shliach in Manhattan who is doing a lot of activity of getting young people together, and now there's a big Shacharis of getting tzitzis for the soldiers in Eretz Yisrael, and so he has 100 to 150 people coming together in putting in tzitzis. So one thing about putting tzitzis in the evening, that's not a problem. Most posts can say that it's no problem to put in tzitzis at night. What about women? So we've gone through this, that the Alter Rebbe says the halacha is that it is kosher, it's a lechatchila, here's lechatchila, to do a svara ha'achroinot that women shouldn't be putting in tzitzis. Okay, so there was a svara which he also discussed with other rabbonim. If you have a man to do the first knots and chulya, then the continuation could be done by women without any worry. What about children? So then what we're seeing here is with Alter